thanks for joining us here tonight at this Monterey Peninsula College Guest Authors Series event. I'm Henry Marchand. I'm with the Creative Writing Program here at MPC. Before we get really running here, I'd like to thank the folks and the entities that help to make these events possible. Prominent among them are the Humanities Division in the English Department, the MPC Foundation, the Arts Council for Monterey County, and of course, viewers like you. Special thanks must be given to some individuals: Michelle Brock and Rosa Arroyo in the Humanities Division office, Diane Boynton, the Chair of Humanities. Then we have Jeanette Haxton of our Public Information Office, and Ruth Killens, who helps us to schedule these things. The logistics are not my strong point. I need all these people. It wouldn't happen without them. And then we have Steve Retzky and Gary Bolin of the theater to thank. And I'd like to give a special thanks to MPC President Dr. Walt Tribleys, who's here with us tonight. His presence is quite thrilling for me. I'm glad to see him. And it's probably because he's a Longmire fan, but hey, it's good to see him. And special shout out to Judy Johnson, the wife of our guest author tonight. Now, to the main event. Craig Johnson's novels, the 9 and soon to be 10 in the Walt Longmire Mystery Series, are genre fiction. They are contemporary Western mysteries. But they're genre fiction with a difference. I'm always struck when I read one of the books by the fact that I'm less interested in the central mystery than I am in spending some more time with Walt and Henry and Vic and Ruby and the rest of the Absaroka County Sheriff's Department. The books are character driven. And for me, the real interest in it is in the characters, and it's in the relationships between the characters. And in a really profound way, it's about the relationship of place and person. These books occur in a sparsely populated area of a very sparsely populated state. They couldn't happen elsewhere. The people are grown from that soil, with one notable exception being Vic from Philadelphia. And boy, did she point out the differences between Wyoming and the East Coasters. It's about how place informs personality and how we are where we're from. And that's how I think of the books. The whodunit is always intricate and baffling and a lot of fun. But I just like going back time after time and spending time with the big guy with the badge and all his cronies. And Craig has very, very skillfully created an indelible cast of characters that just rewards you returning to the books again and again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. And join me in welcoming novelist Craig Johnson.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the college for allowing me to be here. If they knew more about me, they wouldn't have allowed me to. I'd like to thank Henry for wearing his boots and making me feel more at home, which was very nice. Back there listening, and it was interesting this afternoon, talking with the students, I have to admit, because I kind of had to go through what stories it was that I could tell them and what stories I couldn't. Because my life has changed quite a bit in the last few years. We've had quite a few things happen. Most importantly, I guess, this TV show that's on Monday nights. That's based off of the books. It's actually the highest rated scripted drama in 80s network history, and that's kind of amazing. So my life has changed to a certain extent, and the best way that I can use to describe that is that when I started the book tour last year for Serpent's Tooth, I always start the tours at the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody, which is an absolutely magnificent museum. If you have a chance, make sure you get a chance to go there. And we were leaving there, and we were going up to Billings to fly out because my wife refuses to fly on the planes that fly out of northern Wyoming, because they're the ones where they hand you the leather helmet and the goggles, and tell you to back up when the prop starts, And so we're on our way up to Billings to jump on the plane, and I was hungry, and so my wife, we stopped in Red Lodge, a little cafe there, and went in, had some lunch, and came back out. And it was kind of funny, like, because when I'm not wearing one of these, like, I'm wearing one of the Absaroka County Sheriff's Department hats, one of the ball caps. Like, and so, I got the prototype whenever my wife opened up the Walmart, which is, with all the Walmart stuff. And so I had on that Absaroka County Sheriff's Department hat, and I went over to pay the check for lunch. And the woman behind the counter who owns the cafe, she looked at me and she goes, "Where'd you get that hat?" And she said it really aggressive like that, and I thought, oh no, she thinks I'm a real sheriff's deputy and there's some kind of a problem, and I'm gonna have to go chase somebody down the main street of Red Lodge, Montana. So I looked at her and I pointed at my head and I said, "It's not a real county." And she goes, "The hell it's not, it's Walt Longmire's county." And I said, "Well, I'm Craig Johnson." And she goes, "So?" And I said, I'm the one that writes the books. And she goes, "What books?" And it just felt like things were getting worse and worse. And I kept thinking, just shut up and leave. Just leave the check and go. But I couldn't do it. I looked at her and I said, "The books that the TV show is based off of." And she looked at me and she goes, "There are books?" And I remember telling Viking Penguin, later that year, I said, "That should be our motto for the tour this coming year." Yes, there are books. And it kind of hurt my feelings for a while, like that. But then, I've got a motorcycle tour that I do that's like an addendum to the big national tour that I do. I kept getting all of these emails from little bookstores, up in Montana and Idaho and Oregon and Washington, Utah, and they would write me and they would say, "When is Viking Penguin going to send you to Baker City, Oregon?" And I would have to say, "Never." But I thought, if I collected all these little independent bookstores, I would finally have enough of them that I could do a loop. And I had this old motorcycle, and I thought, what the heck? So I started doing this 5,000-mile loop on the bike about 5 years ago. And it's kind of nice because it's kind of a chance to clear your head a little bit after being handled, for like a month. And so anyway, I took off on the motorcycle on that same tour, and I got as far as Livingston, Montana. I was going to a little bookstore there called Elk River Books, and I was there about an hour early. And so I thought, I'll go over to the Stockman Bar, which is around the corner there. It's an old bar that's been there since the 1930s. And it's kind of famous because they make a really good pork chop sandwich. And so I thought I'll slip in there, have some lunch, and then go to the event. So I go to the next door, I walk in, sit down at the stool, order up an iced tea, and the young woman starts to bring the iced tea back over to me. And when she starts to bring it back over, I happen to look up on the bar back, and A&E is on the bar, actually on television. And one of the promos, one of the commercials for Longmire comes on, and she just stops dead and watches the Longmire promo for the whole 90 seconds, right? So, I sit there and I wait. She comes over and she sits the iced tea down. I thought, I'll play devil's advocate is what I'll do. And I looked at her and I said, "Have you ever seen that television show, Long Mirror? Have you ever watched it or anything?" And she goes, "Yeah, I do. It's on Monday nights. It's really good. It's one of my favorite TV shows." And I'm sitting there going, yeah. And then she leans across the bar and looks at me and says, "But you need to read the books because they're better." And I told her, "You don't know how happy I am to hear you say that." The woman down in Red Lodge, I'd like you to go kick her ass. But, life was not always that way for me. That I have to admit, that whenever I started writing books about the sheriff of the least populated county, the least populated state in America, I kind of kicked it off like that, and I was telling the writing class, and I see some of the students out here, they're going to have to labor through the story, a Reader's Digest version of the story again. But I wrote the first 2 chapters, The Cold Dish, and they were really bad. They were really horrible. And so, I just finished building the first part of my ranch, because I built my ranch myself. I poured the concrete, stacked the logs, and did it all myself. And I sat down and I wrote those first 2 chapters of The Cold Dish. They were really bad. And I thought, well, what's wrong with them? Why is there a problem here? And I thought, the problem is you don't know enough about sheriffing. You need to go and talk to a sheriff and find out, how they do what they do. And so I drove the 18 miles into Buffalo, looked at the county seat, and I got there and walked in, introduced myself to the sheriff, told him, I said, "My name's Craig Johnson. I've got a little ranch out near Ucross, population 25, and 23 because Judy and I are here tonight." And I said, I'm wanting to write a murder mystery about a Wyoming sheriff, and I was wondering if you would be willing to, kind of work through the book with me, if you would. And he said he would. He said he would be happy to help me do that. And I walked out of there, and I was so, pleased that I'd solved my problem that I went home and added on to my house. Then I built a barn and a corral, in the shop, and added on to the house again, all this. Came back out of the house and opened up the third door down on the right-hand side, and those two lonely little chapters of the cold dish were looking up at me, and 10 years had gone by. And so I pulled them out and I read them, and they were just as bad as I remember them being 10 years previously. Like, I thought, you're gonna have to go talk to the sheriff all over again. And I knew he was still a sheriff because I voted for him 3 times. And I hadn't spoken a word to him, like I hadn't even like even seen him. And so, I went into town to put gas in my truck, and I was standing there at the Texaco station at the pump aisle, and this cruiser pulls in on the other side of the pump aisle, and this guy gets out, like, and tips his head back and drops his Ray-Bans down, and folds his arms, and he's looking at me while he's filling up the gas, in his cruiser, and he's giving me a look, and the look says, "What did I arrest you for, and when was it?" So I look at him and I said, "Sheriff Kirkpatrick, you're probably not going to remember me." And he goes, "Your name's Craig Johnson. You're the one that's got the little ranch out near Ucross, and the one that's writing a murder mystery about a Wyoming sheriff." It was a 5-minute conversation for 10 years previous. Wow. I looked at him and I said, "That is amazing." And he looked back at me and he said, "If you don't mind me saying so, this book's going kind of slow." That pissed me off. So I sat down and I wrote the rest of the cold dish. I got the rest of it done in about 6 months, sat down and wrote it all out. And every couple of chapters I would take and I would send in to the Johnson County Sheriff's Department so Larry could take a look at the chapters. And I sent in that first couple of chapters in like maybe about 2 weeks after I'd had a little confrontation with him there at the Texaco station. And so it was like, I don't know, 11 o'clock at night or something. And so I sent him via email, I think chapters 1 through 4. So I had 2 more chapters to add to the ones that he'd already read. So I send them off, and I go to bed. I get up the next morning. I've got a ranch, right? So I'm up very early, like at 4. The sun comes up. About 5:30, I get up and I make a cup of coffee, and I'm getting ready to go down to the barn, and I hear a siren in the distance. Ucross, Wyoming is not a place where you hear sirens in the distance. It's just not, And so I take my cup of coffee and I walk out on the front porch, and I'm standing there with my cup of coffee, and I look down the ranch road. At the end of the valley, I see a squad car with the lights and the siren and everything all going, sliding to a stop at the end of the ranch road, and then come barreling up the ranch road and slides to a stop right there in front of the house. And I'm standing there on the front porch, at the edge of the steps with my cup of coffee, and the thing slides to a stop, the door flies open, Sheriff Larry steps out and goes, "I know who did it." And all I could think was, I must be really shitty at this. And so I said, "Larry, are you sure you want to guess? I mean, you're only 4 chapters into a 16-chapter book with an epilogue. Are you sure you want to guess?" He goes, "I'm a trained professional. I know who did it." I said, "Okay, who did it?" He guessed. He was wrong. And I told him, I said, "You're wrong." Okay, he just looks at me like he straightens his hat back, and he goes, "Damn." Gets back in the car, shuts the door, turns around, drives back down the ranch road. And all I could think was, God, I really lost that source, haven't I? So, maybe about 2 weeks later, I got another chapter done, and I thought, well, what the heck, I'll go ahead and send it into the sheriff's department just to see if I can get a response. Okay, so, I sent the chapter in, about 20 minutes later, the phone rang, and it was Sheriff Larry. Okay, he goes, "I know who did it now." I said, "Larry, you can't guess after every chapter." He said, "The hell I can, it's my county, I can guess any time I want." So I said, "Okay, well, who do you think it was?" He guessed again, he was wrong again. And I told him so. And I said, "Not only am I starting to feel a lot better about my abilities as a crime fiction writer, I'm starting to feel a little bit shaky about the abilities of the Johnson County Sheriff's Department in the process of homicide investigation." He said, "Well, you're just changing it every time I guess." And I said, "No, Larry, I've got a 10-year-old outline that I'm working from." And he guessed after every single chapter all the way through the book, and he never got it right. So I started feeling a little bit better about myself at that point in time. But yeah, it's been interesting. Like that, whenever I started doing performances, whenever I started doing events, the first group that ever got in touch with me was actually the MPC Library. And MPC is a little town over on the western side of Wyoming with a population of 351. So it's a bigger town. And so they called me up and they said, well, actually they wrote me an email, and they said, "Is there any way you think about doing a library event here in MPC?" And I wrote him back and said, nobody ever asked me to do anything in the library other than shh. So I'm going to take full advantage of this. So I wrote back and said, "Absolutely, I'd be delighted to come over and do an event." And she wrote me back about 3 minutes later, and she said, just so you know, we're just a little branch library out of Cody here in Park County, and we don't have a lot of money for honoraria. So, we just kind of have to know, what your honoraria is, for doing an event. And I wrote her back and I said, once you reach a certain level of literary notoriety, you really can't negotiate your honoraria. Like I said, mine's the same as it's always been, a 6-pack of Rainier beer, cans preferred. And she wrote me back 3 minutes later and said, done. And the problem was that got into all of the newspapers in Wyoming. There you go. All of a sudden, I was the host, of choice for all the 73 libraries that are in Wyoming. And consequently, I've done a lot of library events in Wyoming in the last 10 years. I've bought beer like 7. But it's kind of been interesting because the way things have changed just a little bit. We had one instance where I went down to Cheyenne, the state capital, and I went down and did an event there. And when it came time, for them to pay me the honoraria, they brought it out in a brown paper wrapper. Let me tell you how much librarians love to bring beer into their library. And so they bring the package out, and they set it down, and it was an 18-pack of Rainier beer. It's random feather bedding down the state capitol. And so they give me the 18-pack of beer, and the librarian there, she goes, this was really kind of hard to get. And I said, well, yeah, I know it's kind of a blue-collar D-Class A beer, so a lot of the bars, don't carry it. And she said, no, you don't understand, the distributors had a hard time getting it. And I said, oh, yeah, I know, it's because the bars don't carry it, the distributors don't carry it either. And she goes, no, you still don't understand, they're out of beer. This was 2 weeks into Longmire. And so, I got home and I thought to myself, this sounds a little fishy, I'm gonna check it out. So I call up the national headquarters for Rainier Beer, and I said, hey, have you guys, we are out of beer. We are totally out of beer. And I said, and they said, we don't have any idea what's happening. We'll get a huge spike in sales. I kind of got an answer for that, really, if you want to know. And then the capper was when they told me, they said, well, don't worry about it because we're in full production and we'll be back on the shelves in about 4 days, which kind of gives you an indication of how long it takes to make Rainier beer. I mean, if you're laboring under the thought that it's aging in fine oak casks up in the Olympic mountains or something, you need to rethink that, okay? And then the other Rainier story that happened to me most recently was the one where I actually was out on the Powder River country doing research on the motorcycle. And I go to a lot of really out of the way places, and this is my town, Ucross, is the crown jewel of the UCLA area. That would be Ucross, Claremont, Lider, and Arvada. With a combined population of I think about 250 people, I think at best. But I was out in that area, near the bar in Arvada, and I was heading home looking, and I thought, what, I'll go ahead and I'll stop and take a little break, maybe, and grab a beer. And so I go in, I walk up, and I look, and as I go in the bar, there's a big sign on the bar back that says, Longmire and Long Necks Monday nights. And I look at the bartender and I said, what's the story on this? And he goes, well, Craig, a lot of the ranchers out here on the Powder River country, they don't have, cable television, and they don't have satellite dishes or anything like that. So, a lot of them, they come in and they watch Longmire on Monday nights. And then we have long neck bottles of Rainier beer for $1 a piece. He says, the place is like the Super Bowl, it's packed. And I said, that's really kind of great. Okay. And he goes, no, Craig, you don't know how great that is. The last show they used to come in and watch was Gunsmoke. But it's been interesting, because the whole TV thing started about maybe I guess two years ago, and it was interesting to me because generally the first thing that that Hollywood does is kind of kick the author to the curb in these situations. I was very fortunate to be with a group of individuals: Greer Shepard, Hunt Baldwin, and John Coveney, in the group, and Chris Chulak and others. And they were really a good group that had done ER. Done The Closer and Nip Tuck and a lot of these other shows. And so it was interesting because the first meeting that I had with them, I think they pretty much decided that, well, we can either get somebody who's knowledgeable about sheriffing, Wyoming, the Northern Cheyenne tribe, and all these other things, or we can just kind of put Craig on a retainer, which has led to me getting text questions at 3 a.m. which say, which way does the Powder River run, north or south, because we want a body to wash off the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And I had to tell them, no, Tongue River, that's, because the Powder River runs north and on to the res. But it's been a unique situation. I don't think I really understood just how serious they were about having me involved with the process until they started sending me DVDs of the actors that they were considering, for the roles, which was kind of unheard of. And because the first time that I had a conversation with them, they asked me, they said, do you ever think of any actors? What actors would you think of who could play someone like Walt Longmire? And my immediate response was, Gary Cooper, Ben Johnson, Joel McRae, which they said was absolutely no help whatsoever. And so then what happened was they started sending me these DVDs, these packets, with all of these actors attempting to be Walt Longmire, which was kind of interesting. And a lot of them were really big names. Like they had two different directions that they could go in casting of the character. As far as that was concerned, they could actually go with somebody who was a big name that would draw, an audience to the show, or they could go with somebody who was a relative unknown. And I was kind of rooting for the relative unknown. The only problem with the relative unknown is that Walt is not exactly a spring chicken. That character is, he's what I tend to refer to as over. He's overweight, overage, overly depressed, but he still gets up in the morning and still does the job. And that's what, in my mind, makes him heroic. And so I was kind of rooting for the unknown guy. Well, the problem with being the unknown actor, when you're, because you got to be at least in your 50s to play somebody like Walt Longmire. And if you're in Hollywood and you're in your 50s and you're still unknown, you might suck. And Hollywood is really nervous about that suck factor. It's something they're really trying to avoid at all costs. So I was watching all of these guys, be Walt Longmire. We're sitting in the kitchen, they're at the ranch house. Judy's sitting at the kitchen table behind me, and I'm feeding the DVDs into the DVD player where she watches ball games up on the wall. And so I'm putting them in, and we're watching all these guys. And I'm not overly impressed, really, with a lot of them, I have to admit. Because a lot of them, you know as well as I do that if a character wears one of these, in the last 20 years, there are about 6 guys that end up, playing that role, and they've kind of been to the well one time too many, you don't really see them as the character anymore. You kind of see them as this conglomeration of all of these characters that they play, rather than, as the character itself. So I was, like I said, rooting for the unknown guy, and I'd gone all the way through the DVDs, and finally got to the last DVD, and I looked, and at the bottom, they'd written on the bottom of it, they'd said, it's Robert Taylor. And I said, well, they took my advice after all. I thought, this is going to be difficult, because I know they're doing amazing things with CGI. I don't think this is going to work. But one of the big problems that they had, with the character was they asked me, they said, why is Walt as big as he is? Because in the books, Walt is about 6'5" and weighs about 255, 260 pounds. He was an offensive lineman at USC. He was an investigator in Vietnam, Marines. He's a big guy. And they asked me, they said, why is he as big as he is? And I said, well, a lot of the counties in Wyoming are the size of Maryland, and so, you've got these limited, abilities, limited resources that a lot of these sheriff's departments have. And a lot of time, you answer calls, you're pretty much on your own. So let's say that there's a bar fight, out at that bar that I was talking about out there in Arvada, and Walt drives at high speed, for 30 miles to get out there and slings the door open where 8 miners are in there beating the heck out of each other. He does not want to open that door and have them look at him as the 9th guy in the fight. And I didn't want him to be one of those studied kind of like, Navy SEAL kind of characters, I didn't want him to be one of the twisted, the 6'2", twisted steel and sex appeal. Every woman wanted him, every man feared him. He could only one with a number 2 Taekwondo rubber pencil. I wanted him to be a regular guy, and I thought, well, at least I can make it big, so at least he'll be durable for all the stuff that I'm going through, right? So I did, and so they couldn't figure out why it was he was as big as he was. I said, well, it's just because, he's got to last, he's got to be durable, and it's a lot easier if he's a big guy. And I said, it really doesn't matter anyway, because everybody in Hollywood is 5'4". They didn't think that was very funny at all. And so anyway, I got the DVD and I put it in, and I look at the bottom of the envelope, and the producers had actually sent me a note on the bottom. They'd scribbled on the bottom, he's 6'3", nah, 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 nah. was like, all right, okay. So I'm watching him. I'm watching Robert Taylor, like that, and he's got a couple of things I really liked about him right off the bat. And one was the lines on his face. He had age on him. He looked like he'd been out of doors the majority of his life. And anybody who does Western sheriffing knows that's usually where the problems are when you spend the majority of your life. And we had a lanky quality to him like that. He looked like he had some miles on him. And I thought, okay, this guy might be the one. And in the audition, he did something that none of the other actors did. In the audition, he's going into a woman's house, and he's, basically it's a notification of death. He's telling this woman that her husband is dead and is not coming home. He's never met this woman before. He's never been in her home before. And he was the only one that did this. Took off his hat. And I was like, there's our guy right there. And I was pretty happy about that. I was completely on the Robert Taylor bandwagon. And about that time, that's when my wife behind me said, oh my. I turn around and I look at her and she goes, he's handsome. So I look at him and I look at her and I look at him and I look at her and she looks at me and she goes, he's kind of like a television version of you. Taller, better looking with a better voice. So I don't like Robert Taylor as much as I used to. And then the next, as you work your way down the line, I got the next character in the book, Henry standing there, who was based off a good friend of mine, Marcus Red Thunder, up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. It was interesting because they were having some trouble, finding, a Henry. They were trying to find just the right guy. It's a little bit difficult, because the time has passed, when you can use somebody who's not Indian and not have them play those roles like that. And I do say Indian, I don't say Native American because all of my Indian friends make fun of me when I try and be politically correct and use the term. Whenever I say Native American, they always look at me and go, where were you born? I say, I was born in America. So you would be a Native American too, then, wouldn't you? It's more important that you get the tribal designations right than it is, to be politically correct. And so, anyway, I knew they were having trouble with the character, trying to find somebody to play the role. And finally, I get another packet of DVDs that has one DVD in it. And I look down and it says Lou Diamond Phillips is what it says on it. And, I put the DVD in and looked at my wife and I was like, he's way too young and too skinny to play this role. And so I put the DVD in and I'm watching Lou Diamond Phillips, do his audition. And the first thought that enters into my mind was, when was La Bamba? That was a while ago, wasn't it? You don't have to lose out in great shape. It doesn't look fantastic, but it's like the rest of us. He's human, He's gotten a little older, got a few lines in his face and everything. And I'm watching his audition like that. And one of the things that kind of blew me away was in the audition, they had made a mistake and included 3 contractions. There was an isn't, a wasn't, and a don't. And for those of you who read my books, you know that Henry does not speak in contractions. He doesn't use them. And so I thought it was interesting, because all the other actors that attempted the monologue had included the contractions. And when Lou Diamond Phillips did his audition, he took the contractions out. And I was like, he's read my books. And he'd worn out, I guess he'd learned, that the pilot and the TV show was based off of a series of books. And he's a really big reader, a very voracious reader. And he went out that weekend and bought The Cold Dish, Death Without Company, and Kindness Goes Unpunished, and read all 3 that weekend. And came in and did the audition that Monday and got the role, which I thought was pretty wonderful, I gotta admit. And then the other thing that he did that was pretty fantastic was about 2 weeks after he got the role, he jumped on a plane at LAX and flew up to Billings and got out of the airport with my buddy Marcus and went down to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and did 4 days of gifting ceremonies, tribal elder ceremonies, and sweat lodge ceremonies. At the end of the 4 days, the Northern Cheyenne adopted him into the tribe. Isn't that great? Yeah. I've been doing this for 10 years, they haven't adopted me. Starting to feel like a redheaded stepchild of the Northern Cheyenne. But what was funny was when I was there, he actually, Marcus met him, and they went down to go get the bags off the racks, and they go down, they get Lou Diamond Phillips' bags, and Marcus looks at the bag handler guy, and he says, thanks, Doug, we really appreciate it. And then they leave, and they go outside, and they jump in Marcus's truck, and they're getting ready to leave, and they're paying for the parking, and Marcus looks at the ticket guy and says, thanks, Steve, we really appreciate it. you know, and they get ready to pull out. Marcus is, and he just drives on. Lieutenant Phillips is thinking, you know, wow, he must fly out of the airport a lot because he knows everybody in the airport by their first name, for God's sakes. Like, so they go down over a hill, like, and then they get down there where there's, you know, a store. Like, they're going to buy some stuff, you know, for one of the gifting ceremonies. And they go in the store, and there's a young woman standing in the aisle, and she tells them, you know, where to go to get all the stuff. And you know, Marcus looks at her and says, "Thanks, Shirley, we really appreciate it." Finally, it's more than Lieutenant Phillips can stand, and he finally turns around and looks at you know, Marcus, and he says, "What, do you know everybody in Billings, Montana?" And Marcus looks at him and says, "Everybody's got a name tag, yeah." If you don't think that's not going to end up in a book, you're crazy. But yeah, it's been a unique experience like that, and we've actually been down there on the set, you know, watching them film the TV show. And you know, the first time that I met Robert Taylor, I remember standing in the back of Walt's cabin. We're standing there talking for a while, and he's telling me about, you know, Walt Longmire. You know, he's been studying, you know, reading the books and all this. He's telling me about Walt Longmire for like 10 minutes. He's telling me about Walt Longmire, who he is, you know, his background, how he feels about things, and all this stuff. And all of a sudden, he just stops dead and drops his head and goes, "I can't believe I've been telling you about Walt Longmire." And I told him, I said, "Well, you know what? You know, there was only one expert, you know, when we started today, like that. But by the time we get finished, there's going to be two." So it's been a unique experience. Like that, we've had, you know, a lot of really wonderful things happen in the last few years, like that, and. But nothing quite compares, you know, with the joy, I have to say, of just the writing of the books. For me, you know, I mean, I live in a town of 25, like that, and to have the opportunity on March, you know, to come out here where the weather is beautiful. If you've ever been in Wyoming in March, you know I'm here. But the opportunity to come here and meet people that have read the books, okay, and talk with people that have read the books, that's kind of a wonderful opportunity. I think a lot of authors don't really get. And for me, you know, it's even more of a unique situation like that, and it's something that I don't take lightly. It's something that I think is maybe one of the most wonderful things, other than the part of where I get to lock myself in a room by myself and type about my imaginary friends. You know, this is probably the part that I enjoy the most, I have to say, because I always think about all the authors that never really got the chance to meet with people and talk with people, you know, about the work, and I don't take that lightly. For me, it's very, very important. And you know, one indication of that was I actually did the National Book Festival, and they had a reception at the Library of Congress, and they came and got us, you know, in these, you know, chauffeur-driven limousines to take us to these 5-star hotels and everything. So they're loading us all up, and they throw us in the back of these, you know, these limousines like that. We're getting ready to leave, like that. And this one author, a big name author, like that, comes out and throws himself in the back seat across from us, and he looks at us and he goes, "I have been talking and signing all day, and I am absolutely exhausted." And so I start to lean forward, and my wife Judy puts her hand on my arm because she knows I'm going to say something inappropriate. And so I lean forward and I go, "You've never had a real job before, have you?" And he didn't talk to us for the rest of the ride. And then when he got out, my wife looked at me and goes, "You're not going to get a blurb from him anytime soon." And it was okay. I didn't really have a problem with that. And then, the success of the books also has been kind of a surprise overseas. Like that, we've actually become bestsellers in France, which is a little bit of a shock, I have to admit. You know, because if somebody would have said, you know, "Well, these books that you're going to write, you know, about a Wyoming sheriff, you know, they're going to take off in a foreign country," maybe France wouldn't have been the first guess that I would have made. You know? But you know, we go to France like 2 or 3 times a year, which is, you know, really wonderful. And the opportunity to go over there and, you know, discuss, you know, the American West and all these things. And there are a couple of different things. I think there are a couple of different reasons for why it is that the West has such a preoccupation with Europe the way that it does. And I have to give credit where credit's due. The first guy I think that made it really cool to be from the West was this fellow by the name of Buffalo Bill. He did these Western shows, like that he went all over the planet and kind of, you know, showed everybody how the American West, just how beautiful and romantic and epic it could be. And then I think what followed that was the period in the post-war era where we kind of inundated, you know, the rest of the reconstructing world with all of our media, whether it be movies, whether it be books, and then finally when it was television. Well, what was the predominant form at that period in time? The Western. I mean, at one point in time, there were 140 westerns on television. And so for me, it's a nice opportunity to go over there, and kind of give them an indication of what the West is like now, because I write contemporary westerns. And so it's kind of an exciting proposition for me like that. But I have to admit that sometimes the jet lag gets a hold of me, and sometimes it's a little bit more difficult, to try and be perky whenever I'm there. The other thing is like, we get there, and I do events pretty much constantly, whereas my wife has a lot more free time, to go and take advantage of the cultural opportunities. And I don't want to come across as a bore or anything like that, but there are times like when I don't want to go to the museums because I want to go take a nap. And there was a point in time where she took me to the Louvre, I think it was for the third or fourth time, and it was finally more than I could take. And for those of you who have been, it's a large plaza area, with big archways all the way around it, and then there are escalators that go down into where the museum is. And I got to the edge of the escalator and I just balked like a mule. I just stopped, And I looked at her and I said, I can't do this. I've got to go take a nap. And she looked at me and she goes, what are you going to do? You're going to walk over, back to the hotel? It's all the way halfway across town. And I said, no, I'm just going to go up in one of these archways over here and just take a nap in one of those. And she looked at me and she said, you're going to get arrested. And I said, no, I'm not going to cause any trouble or anything. I'm just going to go over there and I'm going to take a nap. It'll be perfectly fine. Don't worry about it, okay? So she goes on head down, and I go off to one of these archways. And there was this one archway that was, roughly maybe the size of, maybe twice the size of this proscenium arch here. And, it was called the Denon Archway. They were all named, And so I went up there and sat, down and laid down on the top marble step and assumed a position not unknown in the American West. So I got my, hat over my face and I'm laying there. And after a couple of minutes, I've got a towel. I can pretty much fall asleep anywhere, anytime, place, any position. And so I'm asleep, and all of a sudden I hear some noise, So I go ahead and lift my hat up and I look down, and there are three little boys down at the base of the steps down there, and they've got their little school hats on and their little school backpacks, and they're looking up at me. And one leans over to the others and goes, "Le cowboy." So I started laughing, and then they ran off, around this, pillar down there. They ran around and disappeared. And so I started to put the hat back over my face, and I hear, and they raise back up and look, and they're there again, and run back away again. And so I'm getting ready to cover my face back up for the third time, and this, beautiful young woman comes around the corner there, and she looks up at me, and in perfect English, she looks up at me and says, "I'm really sorry to disturb you. I don't want to bother you like that, but the boys in my class were wondering if they could come over and have lunch in your archway." I mean, it's an archway the size of an end zone, all right? How arrogant do they think I am? So I was like, sure, if they'd like to come with 38 little boys come running around the door there and set up around me like I was a campfire, I mean, they're all around me, like that, and I guess the way that French children are taught is that they can ask you questions, but they have to establish some sort of rapport with you, and so they were giving me bits of their lunch, is what they were doing. They were giving me like little bits of cookie, little bits of apple, and everything. And after a while, I started feeling like a trained bear, And so, and they would hold the food out and ask me the question, they would, "What's your horse's name?" And then they would pull the food back, like, I might not answer, And so I would answer, and then they would give me the food, I would eat it. And then they hold the food out. "What about the Indian problem?" And I'd be like, "Well, we're kind of past that now. We all kind of get along, to an extent, and all this stuff like that." And I'm going along. It went on for like, an hour and 40 minutes. And finally, my wife comes back, from being in the Louvre, and what I'd done was I was taking my hat and putting it on all of their heads and making them raise their right hand and pledge allegiance to Jean Autry. So there's going to be about 40, French cowboys roaming around the American West here in no time flat, just so you know. I'm going to be partially responsible for that, I have to admit. It's been kind of nice, and being in the place where I'm from, that sometimes you don't notice things and aren't really aware of the kind of effect that things are having like that. But I happen to be over there doing that library event in Metizzi. I do it again every year, like that, because, well, it's a six-pack, So I was up there doing the event here just this last year, and I actually started to drive home, with my wife's car. My wife's car is a little bit faster than my truck, and so I, get ready to go. And the rancher that I was staying with, he looked at me and he goes, "Well, make sure you keep your speed down because the detachment 3 HPs are handing out tickets like they're hotcakes." And I said, "Yeah, okay, no problem at all." And so anyway, we take off and we're leaving. Like we're cutting through the red desert, and it's it's like 40 minutes. I haven't seen another vehicle, and I'm going a little fast, and your foot just automatically goes down. Your right foot, you don't see anybody for a while. It's crazy. And so I'm driving along, and all of a sudden I see another car come over the hill going the other direction. And I said, "Look, it's another car." About that time, the light bar comes on that car. And so I pull over the side of the road, and I've got my license and registration hanging out the window. And the highway patrolman spins around, pulls up, gets out, straightens his hat. They always straighten their hat. He walks up, and I hand him the license and registration. He looks at me and he says, "You know how fast you were going?" And I'm always, amused when they ask that question, because I always wonder, if you guess right, do you still get the ticket? And so he looks at me and he looks at my driver's license, and I said, I think I was about, start to hedge my bets, because I thought, well, about 7 or 8 miles over the speed limit, I think. And he looks at me and he goes, "Now, Mr. Johnson, you're about 17 or 18 miles over the speed limit." I'm going to get the ticket now. He pauses and he looks at my driver's license, at my insurance card. He looks at me, he looks at me again, and goes, "I read your books, Mr. Johnson." And I look over at my wife and I go, "This could go either way." And he said, no, he says, "I really, really enjoy your books." He said, "What I really enjoy is the humor. What I really enjoy is the fact that, that the characters have such senses of humor." He said, "As a police officer, I know what it's like, to have a difficult job. It's important to have that type of sense of humor, and I think that you really do a good job of representing that." So we had a really wonderful conversation going. And we're talking for like 10 minutes or so, and there's a little lull in the conversation. And in that lull, he looks at me and he goes, "I'll be back in just a minute." And he turns around and he walks off with my license and registration. So off he goes. So I'm sitting there with my wife thinking, boy, this is not so good. I thought, "Oh, what the heck, I haven't got a ticket in 12 years, what the heck, I'm going to get a ticket now." So I'm sitting there waiting, maybe about 5 minutes later, he comes back, and we had a lot of wonderful things happen, as I've said, but I don't think anything is going to quite compare with having that Wyoming highway patrolman hand me the blue warning ticket and say, "We wish you'd slow down, Mr. Johnson. I could get some more books out of you." Thank you. I'm leaving a little bit of extra time for Q&A, because if you have some of the students are out here that were in the class this afternoon, and the way it works is you ask me a question, it takes me about 20 minutes to answer, okay? So I think we have time for, maybe 2 questions. But I wanted to make sure that we had enough time. So I'm hoping you won't be bashful and that you will ask questions. So and boy, I tell you what, I'm so proud of you guys. You're not bashful at all. Yes, sir.
When you're writing, how does your writing day go, and do you write from an outline?
The question is, what's the basic format of my day, I think, as far as writing is concerned, and do I work from an outline? I'm a rancher, so, the old saying is that ranching and farming is the animals won't wait. And so, generally, like I said, I'm up before the sun, and one of the really wonderful things about the life that I have is there's a real nice balance between the physical world and the intellectual world. I have to put up hay, I have to do 16 cords of firewood every fall. I have to work with the animals, get the irrigation system all working and everything, all the things like that go along with having a ranch. And that reminds me what it's like to work for a living. Whenever I get the opportunity to sit down in that chair and write, I take full advantage of it. And for me, my day generally, we were actually discussing this in the workshop this afternoon, in the sense that there really isn't any magic time for writing. The only magic time is whatever magic time is for you. I tend to be a morning person. I like to get up and get going. I've got a real kind of like what I tend to refer to as a blue collar literary ethic. And so I like to hit it early in the morning. But one of the nice things that I get to do is go down and shovel out the barn And anybody who's ever done work like that knows just how much free time you have in your mind while you're doing that type of work. Even though metaphorically it's an awful lot like producing fiction, to a certain extent. But I get down there like that, and I get the barn all cleared away, and then I discuss with the horses, what it is that I'm going to be riding that day. And they listen very intently because I haven't fed them yet. And they don't offer any advice, so it's really a good conference that I have first thing in the mornings. And so I get everything squared away, and then they come back up to the house, make a great big pot of coffee, and then sit down and start working. And I'll work through until the afternoon, like I take a break for lunch or something like that. And then I'll work through the afternoon on into the evening, like that, because for me it's a joy. It really is. Like I have a wonderful time doing what I do. I am getting away with murder, no pun intended. And for me, it's the same thing. I think is the same for a lot of the readers. In the sense that I can't wait to get back there and find out what's going on. I can't wait to get in there with those characters and see what's happening in their lives. What they're going to say or what they're going to do. And for me, that's probably one of the most amazing things about my life is the enjoyment that comes from that. If somebody would have told me that I would be having more fun writing the 10th and 11th book in a series of books than I did the first or second or third or whatever, I would have laughed. I would have thought that wasn't possible because I had so much fun writing those first books. But I'm having even more of a blast writing now. It's still a joy. As far as the outlining is concerned, I'm a big one for outlining. I outline living daylights out of my books. We were discussing that this afternoon too. There are a lot of authors that they'll say, I just start writing and see where it goes. That scares the crap out of me. I wouldn't do that for any amount of money in the world. It's kind of like if we were going to go on a trip or something like that, and you would say, let's not take a map. I would say, hey, let's take a map. Okay, we might not use it, but let's take it. Like that. And I think when you're writing, what I tend to refer to as socially responsible crime fiction. I'm not really looking for body counts. Come on, I've only got 25 people in my town, so I gotta be careful with that kind of thing. And so it's kind of important like that I have something more to say than just stacking up bodies like cordwood. And so when I think about those things, I take that into consideration when I'm doing those outlines. And then the other thing it does, you have an outline I was discussing this afternoon, is that it provides you with a good sense of what the pacing of the novel is going to be. Because you can see what that pacing is going to be before you start the novel, before you have to go back and then reset the pacing in the whole book. The other thing it does is it guards against that bugaboo that I don't think really exists, which is called writer's block. That's just lazy writers is what that is. It just means that you don't know what's happening next. Well, if you have an outline, you always know what's happening next. And I think that gives you a real advantage as far as the writing is concerned. So I never write without an outline. I have to admit, I've always got it. Now that doesn't mean that I won't, move away from that outline. It doesn't matter that there won't be some improvisational moments where something will happen along the way in the writing of that book. I think it was Walter Mosley that said, you could do a very clear, outline, and have everything written down about everything about the book that you're going to write, and write that book and accomplish everything in that outline. You have failed because something should have happened along the way. Something should have happened which should have led you down some other road, just some other avenues that maybe you didn't know existed. Whatever that trip was that we were going to go on, we've seen maps, we've seen photographs, we've seen all of those type of things, but we haven't been there. And until you write that novel, until you write that story, you haven't been there. And I think it's important to make sure that you stay open to those kind of improvisational aspects to your writing, because you will discover things in that undiscovered country, in that far country as you go. So. See, I told you this is how it works, 20 minutes, okay, perfect. Yes, ma'am?
Are you involved at all in writing the screenplay for your books, and how has that affected the way you're writing your newer books?
Okay, I'm assuming you said screenplay the books, but I'm assuming you mean the television show.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I'm another set of eyes is what I am. What I do is, because the majority, there's no secret that the majority of the books that I write tend to come from newspaper articles. That everybody always asks. They always say, what's the catalyst that starts off, all of your books. And I have to admit that generally it's a newspaper article. Okay, and I'll be somewhere, traveling to a town, and I'm a big fan of newspapers, and so I'll be going to a town and I'll pick up a newspaper article. and start reading about something that's a situation, I'll think to myself, you know what, that's a good Walt Longmire story there. And the further down the road you go, the better you get at handicapping stories. You kind of get to be like, almost like when you're at the racetrack or something, because you'll start looking at stories differently. You'll say, oh, that's a good story, but I don't think it can go the distance, It doesn't have a bottom. I don't think it can go 350, 400 pages, but it might work as a short story, or it might work as a teleplay. And so one of the things I did was I took a great big bundle of all of the newspaper articles that I didn't think really fit, for a book that I'd been saving up for 7 years, and I sent them off to them down there at Warner Brothers. And by golly, they used every single one of them. I don't know what we're going to write about this year. I don't know. Walt's going to play pinochle on his desk or something like that. No, but what they do is they have a room full of writers, and then what they do is they come up with a synopsis for each one of the episodes. They send me those synopsises, and then I give them feedback on those as to whether it would be a sheriff's jurisdiction, whether it could actually happen in modern day Wyoming, those type of things. And then they actually sit down and they write the episode, send me the episode, and I go through and line it on the episodes and give them feedback all the way through and send it back to them. So that's pretty much what my input is. But that's probably where I'm the best, because I'm a writer. I can't really help them with the acting. I can't really help them with the costuming or any of the other stuff that they do. But the writing part I can kind of assist on a little bit, which is nice that that they allow me to be a part of that. It's kind of nice. Yes, ma'am.
You don't talk much like a rancher.
I don't talk much like a rancher. what would you prefer?
Western accent like Montana, Wyoming, that type of thing.
Oh, really? Yeah, most people tell me I have too much of an accent. So, wow. I guess I just don't fit yours, I guess. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, we're from Yuba City, California, Southern Buttes Women's Literary Society, about 16 gals. We love your books.
Oh, thank
you.
you.
Love when you write and your characters. So we read a lot of stuff. We're not, we don't read bodice rippers and stuff like that. Although, forgive me if you like bodice rippers, but. She means books. I mean books, yeah.
Right. In Western parlance, we call them Western shirt rippers.
We love your books, and I know that there are some obvious differences between the show and your books, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they do stay very true to the character of Walt.
Mm-hmm.
It's just amazing how they all, the range of each character's life. The humor in your books, I greatly appreciate. You really have a talent for that as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Have you guys met my mother? That's my little sister, actually. It's kind of a wonderful thing. Like it's a good relationship. Like there are differences. Like there are differences between the television show and the books. One is I remember. I think what it is you really have to be open to allowing people to do what it is that they do. I mean, you try and get the best people that you can to work with, and then let them do the job that they do. And these people are very good at what they do. And so it's another thing there is that you have to take into consideration that it is a different art form. A book is one thing, a television show is another. And I remember, one of the first big altercations that we had was when they said, we're thinking about making Walt and Henry about 10 years younger than they are, in the books. And I immediately had the, redneck, cowboy author response where I was like, well, why are we doing that? Did that sound more like what you were expecting? And they said, well, Craig, we'd really like this TV show to run for about, 10 years, and we'd rather not have Walt and Henry on walkers by the time we get to the end, So that's when I had a great big cup of shut the heck up, And so, generally, when they change things or do things differently, from the books, there's generally a reason for it. And they're very good about explaining to me, because I'm not that smart, so they explain to me why it is that they're changing the things that they're doing, which is very nice, I have to admit. So. Yes, sir.
In class, you told us you sent the manuscript for your first book to your family members. They read it. How did you get from that point to Viking Penguin Press?
It was interesting because I had that manuscript done, and it was horrible because I made the mistake that I think a lot of beginning authors make, in the sense that, I put everything in it. I mean everything, because I thought if I fool anybody into publishing this, boy, it's the only book I'm ever going to publish, so I'm putting everything in there. So subsequently, the first draft of The Cold Dish was 650 pages long. It was like War and Peace in Absaroka County was what it was like. And so, I was lugging this manuscript around, and I actually did a bunch of these cold calls up in New York. Okay. And I had a friend who had made some introductory phone calls for me that had said, look, this cowboy's going to show up, with this manuscript. If you could, let him in the door, please, And so I went to a lot of these, these agents marching up, like 4 flights of steps, walk up, and it was like a Damon Runyon novel. The door would open like, 6 inches just enough for me to slide the manuscript through. The cigar smoke would come up over the transom, and I would hear somebody go, sure kid, we'll let you know. Still waiting for some of them to let me know, and so I was fortunate enough that there was one instance, where there was this one agent that I was going to go see, near Times Square, and my poor wife, had been, drugged through the ringer with me, to all these different agents, and she'd had it. It was a couple of days of this, like that. She finally had it, so she said, I'm just going to wait down here at a coffee shop, and when you come back down, we'll figure it all out. And I said, okay. And so we were flying up the next day, and I went up, and the receptionist said, well, she can only give you about 10 minutes of time. And I said, that's fine. That's 10 minutes more than anybody's given me for the last 3 days. So I went in and talked with her. Well, we started talking, and I could tell we were way past 10 minutes. And the assistant kept coming in and trying to get her out of there. And she kept saying, no, never mind. And so finally she told me, she said, I'm not going to get a chance to read this right away, but I will read it, and I will give you a response. And so, I said, that's great, that's fine. Okay, and so I left the office, and I went back downstairs and got Judy out of the coffee shop where she had about 7 espressos. So she was like, how'd it go? It seemed like it went well. I worked there for a long time. It went well? It seemed like it went well. You went well? You okay? All right, went well? Yeah, you worked there for a long time. You okay? I said, I don't know. I've given up on trying to read these people. I have no idea. I said, let's go back to the ranch. And so we loaded up, flew up the next morning. Got back to the ranch, and the answering machine was blinking when I got there, and it was that agent. And she was the president of the agents union. If she was like Wallace Stegner's, agent, for instance, Scott Turo's agent. And if I had known any of that, I would have chickened right out. I would have even gone in the office there. And but she left a message and said, don't give this to anybody else I wanted. And that's how The Cold Dish got picked up.
Wow.
And the first thing she told me was, she said, you got to cut this down. If I have to deliver it in a wheelbarrow, it's not going to get published. And so I cut, I got 250 pages out of The Cold Dish, and then she took it over to Kathleen Court, the president of Penguin USA. And that's how I got started. And that was kind of funny, because whenever I had the first luncheon with Kathleen Court, we were sitting there with the books. She had an arc, of The Cold Dish, and slid it there between us. And she looks at me and she says, we would like some more of these. And I said, excuse me? And she says, this book, we would like some more of these. And I said, well, I'm happy to write you guys some more books. I've got all kinds of ideas. And she goes, no, I don't think you understand. We would like some more of these. And I looked at her, and she goes, we think the characters, the place, people are going to want more. It's got legs, and people are going to want to know more about them and what happens to these characters. And that's when I, with the knowledge of not even having had one book published, started arguing with the president of Penguin USA. No kidding. I looked at her and I go, well, no, I don't really think that'll work. I've got some other ideas I want to bounce off of you. And she said, why don't you go back to your ranch in Wyoming and sit and think about this? And I did, and thank goodness, I kind of came to the right conclusion, thank goodness. And that's how it all kind of fell into place. Somebody else had their hands up. Yes, sir.
I'm from Sheridan.
Oh my, hey!
Where you are. A local author here several years ago wrote a lot about the family and the lives of Monterey and Salinas. And a lot of the stories that you are writing remind my family of some events around Sheridan and Buffalo.
I bet.
So
There's only 500,000 of us in the state of Wyoming. So inevitably, whenever I put somebody from Gillette in my books like that, and I'm doing a library event in Rock Springs, somebody will look at me and go, "Is that so-and-so that's in your seventh book?" And I have to say, I can either confirm or deny that maybe the person you just mentioned. It's kind of a difficult situation, but.
So you do refer to some of the events around the area?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things where I don't play around. You know, I mean, historically, geographically, I mean, it's a fictitious county like that, but anybody that looks at it knows that it's Johnson County and the Durand's Buffalo and all those things like that. But I try not to monkey around with that stuff, and I love local history. I love the small histories, the stuff that doesn't end up in the textbooks, the stuff that's lost, because it's just, storytelling. And if those stories don't get passed along like that, maybe in print, sometimes they might disappear. And it's one of those places where it's kind of a wonderful place to find those little stories like that and be able to utilize them as much as possible. So I'm guilty as hell of doing that. Like every chance I get, I do it. And I use people that I know. I use stories that they tell me all the time like that. I mean, what's fun for me is like the books have gotten to a certain popularity now to where a lot of sheriffs and sheriff's deputies and highway patrolmen will get in touch with me and say, "I got a story I got to tell you." And the stories are worth their weight in gold, for God's sake. And more outrageous. 9 times out of 10 they're so outrageous I can't even use them. And then inevitably, whenever somebody gives me a hard time about, that beginning of, like, say, Junkyard Dogs, there's no way that could ever possibly happen. And I'm always like, well, let me introduce you to Sheriff Goody Pickering of Bighorn County, Montana, who actually had that instance happen to him. So for me, it's enjoyable to use all those stories like that, but it is kind of a dangerous occupation because friends, family, neighbors, everybody, they're all grist for the mill. Whenever we're out traveling, we'll be traveling and I'll stop at a rest stop and I'll be in there for 20 minutes and my wife will be out there waiting and she knows I'm in there talking to somebody. She knows that's what it is like that. But it's just too much of an opportunity for me like that. But it's that's kind of your job. We discussed that this afternoon too. Like Wallace Stegner had a great quote where he said, the greatest piece of fiction ever perpetrated on the reading public is that disclaimer at the beginning of every book that says nobody in this book is based off of anybody alive or dead. I mean, that's a crock, that's your job, to go and find people to put in your books. And, most recently with Spirit of Steamboat being picked out as the one Wyoming book, it's the first state inaugural read. We don't have enough people in Wyoming to do, town reads. We have to do a whole state read. And my friends in the East, they accuse us of having only one book in Wyoming, which is why they got the one book Wyoming program. It's not true. But, one instance that I told this afternoon was that, when I finished the first draft of the cold dish, I gave it to my brother and I gave it to my mother and father. And I think I waited a full 48 hours before I started badgering them with questions as to whether they read the manuscript yet or not. And so I called my brother and I said, "Have you read that manuscript I wrote?" He goes, "Yeah, I have it. You're dead." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "The old sheriff, Lucian Conley, the one that Walt goes and plays chess with on Tuesday nights, that's our dad, Craig." Crap, I thought I did that really well. No, he looks like Dad, he acts like Dad, he talks like Dad. The only thing you did was cut off one of his legs, and I don't think that's gonna fool Dad. I said, "I gotta go." He goes, "I bet you do." So I hang up, call my mother and father, I get Mom on the phone, she's always wanting to answer the phone first. And I said, "Mom, you guys had a chance to read that manuscript?" And she says, "Oh yeah, I'm about halfway through, it's so good, honey." She's my mother, which is that, right? And so I said, "Has Dad read any of it?" She goes, "Oh, he's about 2/3 of the way through." And I'm like, "Oh man, he's definitely read the Lucian parts, So it's too late to change it." And so I'm sitting there thinking about what it is I'm going to say like that, and my mother on the phone says, "Honey, your father thinks he's Walt Longmire." Now those of you who read my books know just how far apart those two characters are. And I'm sitting there with my mouth hanging open, trying to think about, what it is I'm going to say, right? And so I try to formulate something, some words in my mouth. And my mother comes back on and she goes, "Let's not disabuse him of that thought, shall we?" So my father still walks around thinking that he's Walt Longmire, not disabusing him of that thought. All the way in the back there, yes.
What's your secret to writing such excellent dialogue?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm going to take this out of its home with me tonight. For me, it's just a question of listening, an awful lot of the time, listening to people speak, the words that they use, the phrases that they use, that's probably one of the most important things of the books, I have to admit. But I'm also guilty of something, and that is whenever, it was interesting, because George Woodell, he does the audio versions of my books. How many of you guys listen to the audio versions when you drive a car? Thank you. And George is a marvelous performer. I think he does a magnificent job with the audio books. And it was interesting because, when they did the first book, he did the first recording, he calls me up and we're talking, and I have to give him pronunciations, for the Northern Cheyenne, the Crow, the Basque, all these different places. And he finally gets to the end, he stops for a moment and he says, what is your education? And he said, you can try the old, I'm just an old cowboy bullshit if you want to. He says, but I've read your books and I know you've got an education. He said, what is your education? And I said, well, my undergraduate was actually in biological science. I said, well, my final degree was actually in playwriting. And he said, I knew it. And I said, how did you know? He said, because you never used the tag phrases, he said, she said. He said, you always have a physical action that goes along with the line. And he said, whenever I'm recording a book, it's kind of like performing a play. And he said, one of the biggest stumbling blocks that I run into whenever I'm recording a book is he said, she said. He said, you don't know how many times it is. I'll be reading a book, aloud, and it'll be a man and a woman in a room, and it's he said, she said, he said, she said. There are only two in the room! We know how many there are! So he kind of nailed me on that, and I think that that's also one of the abilities that I kind of gleaned from, and I never really went anywhere with the idea of playwriting, but I knew that I wanted to write dialogue. And it came to me that, boy, there were these guys that did nothing but write dialogue. I mean, the entire expanse of their work, was nothing but a sequence of dialogue. They had to tell that story with the dialogue, because you didn't get to, other than the set design or something like that, you didn't get all of that, undercurrent, that goes along with it, the narrative of the novel. All you had was dialogue to work with. And I think that probably served me in the long run. I think it helped out a lot and made it possible for me to recreate actual human speech on a page, which is not as easy as you might think. It's a little more difficult maybe than people give it credit for. And the humor too. I think a lot of the humor goes along with that too, I have to admit. But thank you for asking that. Yes?
So, because I do listen to them, sometimes I tune out, because you're doing things. And I don't recall.
Driving, yeah.
And I love the A&E series too. So in the series on TV, the Walt's wife, there's some mystery about that.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't happen in any of the books, did it?
No, it didn't.
Okay.
No.
So did you make that up, or did the TV people?
No, the TV people did. Okay. One of the things that they kind of survive on, when you're limited to 42 minutes to tell a story, that's actually one of the difficulties I think that they have. I've heard different comments about things that might be missing, from the books, or from the TV show that are in the books. One of the difficulties is that the books are written in first person. The books are written, as if you were to go in and sit down at the Busy Bee Cafe and Walt Longmire were to sit down next to you and say, let me tell you about what happened to me last month. And from that point in time, I don't want you to even remember that you're reading a book. I want you to fall into that world and just, be enjoying, being in that world. And, with a TV show, it's a little bit more difficult in the sense that, if I were to turn in a 1,000-page Walt Longmire novel at Viking Penguin, they would do little dances in the alleyways. They'd be happy as they could. They probably would even publish that 650-page version of Cold Dish right now. But it was interesting, because with the TV folks, it's a little more difficult. Because they've got 42 minutes to tell a story. Not 42 minutes and 20 seconds, not 43 minutes, 42 minutes, and that's it. And so that kind of makes them kind of focus more on the action and the drama, maybe so much, not so much about the character and so much about the place, to the extent that I do in the novel. I think it makes it a little bit more difficult for them, I think. But I think that they do a pretty miraculous job, but it all seems to kind of mesh on a dramatic conflictive basis. I mean, everything really has to be conflictive. With the characters, wanting and needing different things from each other. And so it makes for a different type of writing. Maybe a little bit more like playwriting than it is, than novel to be honest. So, you bet, my pleasure. Yes?
Why do your novels collectively span such a short amount of time to kind of pick up?
Thank you for noticing that, as a matter of fact. That's one of the things that, I felt strongly about whenever I was going to think about doing a series. We've all read series like that where, you start out reading the series like that, and then you get to the next book and 2 years have gone by. And I'm always like, what happened in the 2 years, I'd like to know what happened. And so for me, it was a little bit more exciting, I had to compress the time so that it was only each book is a season. And the guy that got that figured out for me, there was a fellow I did a little short story contest for Cowboys and Indians magazine that I won, and I got to go have dinner with a lesser known mystery author you probably never heard of by the name of Tony Ellerman. And what was great about Tony is that, I remember asking him, well, how do you do this? How do you write a series of books without it becoming repetitious, without it becoming the same? And I remember him saying, at the risk of it being sounding like a sports analogy, you got to play them up one at a time. And he said the other thing is you got to find a way to differentiate, each book, from any of the others. And so I started thinking about it, and trying to think about what kind of, not only the subject matter, but also, for the environment, the background of each story. And I thought, okay, well, what's the biggest thing that has the largest scale effect on us as Westerners? The weather, the seasons. And so I thought, I'm going to pull a Vivaldi is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the 4 seasons, and have each book take place, in a different season. And, the benefits of that is that, Wyoming in January is nothing like, Wyoming in July. And so it gives me very, very different, environments for each one of the books. The other thing it does is it provides me with a continuity, which I think, is helpful when you're writing a series, in that, there's only, maybe a month or two between every one of the books. And so it's not that hard to remember what happened. And it still has repercussions, in all of the books. And if Walt is hurt in one book, he's still recuperating by the time that next book, rolls around. And so for me, that provides a continuity that I think is, somewhat unique and enjoyable, for me as a writer, hopefully, for everybody as readers too. Yeah.
And Messenger, is that based on a true?
a true porta potty? She was asking a question about there's actually a short story that I wrote. It's kind of an elongated short story that it's called Messenger. And within it, the short story, they have to rescue an owl from a porta potty. And the difficulty is it's Walt and Henry and Vic. And the difficulty being that Walt and Henry are of a certain girth, and they don't fit, and Vic does. And so it leads to probably some of the most colorful language of any of the books and stories that I've ever written. And I have to admit that when Lou Diamond Phillips read that, he really wants to film it really bad. And I'm not sure if it's because he thought it was one of the funniest things I'd ever written, or he really wants to hold Katie Sackhoff over a porta potty. I'm not quite sure which one that is. Hopefully someday I'll be able to find it.
Yes, is that based on a true experience?
Well, which part? The spiritualism, and the aspects of the Mista, the name-giving owls, that bring in it? That's true. That's actually true. And that's another thing I don't monkey with. We were discussing the geography, of not monkeying around with the geography too much. I really don't monkey around with aspects of the spirituality or the culture or the society of the Northern Cheyenne and Crow. I mean, I can write about those things, but I'm not. I'm not Crow and I'm not Northern Cheyenne. I'm part Cherokee. I'm 164th Cherokee, but I don't bring that up in conversation with them because they laugh at me when I do. Marcus actually has a shirt that says I'm 164th white, but I can't prove it. And so, I have to be very careful about that and make sure that I do a good job of being respectful of that culture and of that spirituality, because to them that's very, very important. So if it's that important to them, it's very important to me. Make sure that I get it right. And so I try. I try very wholeheartedly to make sure that I get that stuff correct. Yes?
It seems to me that there was some sort of a controversy when the show depicted Walt having, was that a ceremony, an Indian ceremony?
Uh-huh.
And there was a controversy that was generated with regards to if that was done and if it wasn't appropriate to have a white man participate in that ceremony.
Right, and it's actually a Lakota ceremony. It's actually not a Northern Cheyenne ceremony, it's actually a Lakota ceremony. And so, yeah, there was some controversy about that, you know, and so that wasn't my plot point, so I can't take responsibility for that to a certain extent, so. Yes, sir.
Your Sheriff Walt spent some time in the Army in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. I was kind of impressed with how you handled that.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you yourself spent some time in Vietnam.
No, it's kind of funny like that because I rely a lot on family and friends like that to give me that kind of information like that. And what happened was I wrote. I was very, very careful about writing Another Man's Moccasins, like making sure that I got especially the information correct in that one because part of the book takes place in Vietnam, in 1967. And so I wrote that book, and that was really kind of interesting like that because one of the groups that I got to do a book club with was Camp Lejeune, which had about 200 infantrymen like that and about 20 officers for a book club. And so this was before Skype, so I was just doing it by voice, so they couldn't, see me. And I got to the end, we got to the Q&A part like that, and one of the officers said, well, which battalion did you serve with in Vietnam? And I said, well, no, I was 7 in 1968. And they laughed for a second, they listened to me, and then they said, damn, we've had about 6 or 7 guys that thought they served with you. I felt kind of vindicated at that point, I felt kind of good at that point, I have to admit. But it was a situation where, I was writing about the Vietnam War, like I wasn't writing about the Crimean War. This was, a war that was not that long ago. And so I had to make sure that everything was done exactly right. And a lot of that, came from talking with guys who were actually there. There was actually a Campbell County Sheriff's deputy by the name of Kurt Wendelbo, who has a series of books out now like that. He actually was a military policeman, at Tansen Air Force Base at that period of time. And so I was able to get an awful lot of the really close detail from him, which helped out a lot, I think, because the devil's in the details. You either sink or swim. If you get one thing wrong, you've blown the whole book. But thank you for the kind words. Yes.
I was interested in what you were talking about with his injuries sustaining over the books, because I feel like in a lot of mysteries, the protagonist gets beat to all hell, and in the next book they're fine. Is that something you made a really conscious effort to make happen, or did it just kind of naturally go with it?
It's a tough job, sheriffing is very difficult. A lot of times, you just don't get away unscathed, I think is the biggest problem. And for me, it was important, that Walt be injured, if it was going to be one of those things that happened, that it be treated in a realistic manner. Because he's, like I said, he's not a young guy. So he has to kind of live, with the repercussions, of that damage to a certain extent. But I get 2 emails. The 2 emails that I get after every book are there was not enough of my favorite character, insert character name here. There's not enough Vic, there's not enough Henry, there's not enough. I knew I'd gotten to a certain point whenever I had somebody write me and say that there was not enough dog, in the last book. And that's when I was like, wow, really, dog? And that's when I wrote Junkyard Dogs, I could get a starring role. I was trying to do that as much as possible like that, but I don't know, it's one of those things where, a lot of times I'm going against the rules like that because I'm one of those guys, I have to admit, I'd be a lousy sheriff, because whenever anybody gives me rules, the first thing I start thinking is, how can you break that? How can you do that in a different way? And when I was first starting out, I had a lot of authors who, were giving me advice on what I should do and how I should do it. And one of the things they said was, don't beat up on your character so much like that, and I thought, well, no, it's a tough job, he's gonna get beat up a lot. One of the other things they said was don't give your protagonist any animals, because then you have to take care of those animals. You'll forget about the dog in the house for 3 weeks or something, and people will wonder what the heck happened. And so, but I thought, I got a whole range full of animals I gotta take care of. I don't see why Walt can't take care of his animals too. And then one of the other ones that they gave me was, they said, you can have sexual tension in your books, but you can't have anything happen for like 17 or 18 books. And the only thing I could think was, what kind of women are you dating? That would wait 17 or 18 years for something to happen, And so I blew that one right out of the water in the 3rd book. I had something happen, because I thought, it's going to be controversial, it's going to be difficult, it's going to make, the relationship between the characters that much more, multifaceted and difficult, and they're going to have to deal with that. And I thought that's kind of what a series relies on, is the complexities of character and the development of character. You have to allow those characters to breathe, to grow, to become something, more than they are when you first observe them. And I remember when I wrote my first, little sex scene, it was 3 sentences long. I was really kind of chicken shit when I wrote it. And I wrote it in 3 sentences, like, because I'm a big one for like less is more, whether it be violence or sex or anything like that. Those are the 2 big, physical actions that you see in these type of novels, is sex and violence. We're fortunate in that we live in a society where we're kind of like insulated, from a lot of violence. So a lot of people don't really have, a clear idea of what that kind of violence is like, which is beneficial to me, because I figure I can get it across in a realistic manner. Sex, on the other hand, just about everybody in this room has had sex. And they know, they're all experts if you ask them. And so if you're going to recreate that, you better, get in there and get out. So, no pun intended. So, when I wrote that sex scene, it was like 3 sentences long, right? So I finished it up, and I sent it out into the world. And I remember being on tour, and it was a little north of here, up in Olympia. And I was in Olympia, Washington. I was doing the tour for Kindness Goes Unpunished, and there was a woman in the Q&A section with it. And I get to that part, and she, has her hand up immediately, like it wants to ask a question. And so I said, yes, ma'am. And she says, I want to talk to you about that sex scene that's in Kindness Goes Unpunished. And I said, oh boy, here we go. I said, yes, ma'am, what about it? And she goes, it went on forever. So I'm looking at her and I'm like, it's only 3 sentences long. And everybody in the room starts laughing, and she starts turning red. And I looked at her and I said, how many times did you read it? And she came clean. She goes, I read it a bunch of times. I felt pretty good at that point. Anybody else? Have I talked you out? Yes, ma'am.
A 2-part question.
Okay, maybe I have a 2-part answer. You didn't tell.
Who do you enjoy reading, and when is the next book?
Oh, that's the part that the question was asked. There's a portion of that question that was actually asked before. I didn't answer it. Well, one of them's 15 miles up the road. I read Steinbeck over and over and over and over again. He's one of those mural guys, is what I tend to refer to them as. One of those writers that's able to write about the bigger picture, the zeitgeist of an age, the whole society and culture, and actually comment on it and have something to say. And one of the things he knew was how to write that big, epic, panoramic view, but to do it on a small scale. Because it's always going to be a human scale. It's always going to be the people that are going to be the ones that make the difference. I can tell you a story about the horrors of the French Revolution, or I can tell you about a woman sitting at the base of the guillotine knitting family crests into an Afghan. Well, which one's going to be the one that stays with you the longest? Those are the type of writers that I enjoy the most, I have to admit. And then also somebody asked what were some of the crime fiction writers that I really enjoy. Daniel Woodrell, I think, is right there at the top of my list of writers that I really, really enjoy. He's a writer out of Arkansas that did Winter's Bone. And he's absolutely magnificent, really incredible writer. There's another guy from up in Portland by the name of Johnny Shaw, who I think is a pretty amazing writer too. And then you go down the list, the James Lee Burks, and all those guys like that were right there at the top of the list too. So that's one of the great things I get to do. I get to lay on the sofa and read and tell my wife it's research. Anybody else have time for maybe one more? The new book.
Coming out?
Oh, well, it's my wife who just asked that question. She doesn't ask questions, she just makes statements. Is that right? Oh, you're blaming it on her, are you? Okay. Actually, it's kind of funny that actually the new book that's coming out is the one that I was going to read from you tonight, and I think we're out of time. I don't think I can read to you tonight, but
Yeah, you can talk.
Oh, I'm in trouble, all right. I guess we have time for me to read one last thing here tonight. It's called Any Other Name, and it'll be out on May 13th. It's a book where Walt's kind of roped into a investigation in an adjacent county over in Campbell County. And I don't know what it is about poor Campbell County. I get all noir when I go over to Campbell County. I have to apologize to Gillette and Wright and Bill and everybody over there, but it just seems to kind of automatically happen. What it is it tends to be the winter book is what it tends to be. It's always the winter book. And so, they're in the depths of a despondent, Wyoming High Plains winter. Walt finds himself in an investigation to find out about why it is that a sheriff's investigator committed suicide. And he has to go over and find out what's going on. And so maybe I should just read a little bit from it. That'd be good. If you have to, I have to admit that I haven't read this a great deal, so if I suck, there's a reason for that. So I apologize in advance. You're going to get to see me pull out my reading glasses too. So this will be fun for everybody here. There we go. I'm just going to go from the beginning. Joseph Conrad said that if you wanted to know the age of the earth, look upon the sea in a storm. If you want to know the age of the Powder River country, just be on the wrong side of a coal train. A guy who worked for the Burlington Northern Santa Fe once told me that the trains in northern Wyoming are about 140 cars and a mile and a half long, but it sure seems longer than that when you're waiting on one. Lucian Conley, my old boss and the retired sheriff of Absaroka County, reached into his pocket and pulled out his beaded tobacco pouch the Cheyenne elders had given him, along with the name Edom Nestito, he who sheds his leg. Damn, this is a long one. He also pulled his briarwood pipe from the inside coat pocket of his light jacket, much too light for the weather, and fingered a small packet of wooden matches along with it. We used to get these calls from the railroad detectives. What a useless bunch. Wanting us to come down and identify the hobos that climbed in the hoppers back in Chicago and Milwaukee. With the slick slides of the rail car walls, they couldn't get out. He stuffed a small amount of tobacco into the bowl of his pipe. They pulled those cars into the mines and dumped tons of coal on them. Imagine their surprise. Homeless. He turned to look at me. What? Homeless. They don't call them hobos anymore. He nodded his head and looked back at the train. Flat as a pancake is what I call them. I watched the cars roll and felt the ground shake like a righteous fist. The single largest source of coal in the United States, the Powder River Basin contains one of the largest deposits in the world. It has made Wyoming the top coal-producing state since the late 80s. He pulled a match from his pack and began ready to strike. Pulverized pepper steak. Wasn't a lot to identify, I can tell you that much. The major cities of the Wyoming portion of the basin are Gillette, Sheridan, and in Montana, Miles City. The rest of the 24,000 square miles is what they call sparsely populated, and I call Durant, and home. It was a Saturday. Flat as a flitter. I was tired. Identify my ass, and I was about to lose my patience. Looked like hamburger with too much pepper on it. I scrubbed my hand across my face. Old man, you are not going to light that pipe in my truck. He looked over at me for a moment, the silence between us carrying the electric charge of decades, grunted, and then pulled the door handle and climbed out of the bullet. The clanging of the warning bells amplified through the open door before he slammed it behind him and hobbled on his one real and one fake leg to the corner of my grill guard, at which point he recommenced lighting his pipe with a great deal of dramatic flourish. It was December on the high plains, but you'd never know it to look at him. Cupping his knotted hands together without a shiver or gloves for that matter, and ducking his Stetson open road model hat down against the wind, amplified by the flashing red lights of the railroad crossing barrier. The brief flicker of orange light glowed, reinforcing the impression that he was the devil, and that the deal that I had struck with him was both venal and binding. He raised his head, the consistent wind that battled the onward rushing of the train, pulling at the brim of his hat like a miniature tornado. His eyes almost squeezed shut, with nothing showing but the stained, walnut-colored irises glinting black in the half-light. I looked down at the letter lying on the center console. The postmark was from a week ago, and the return address was Gillette. in the Iron Horse subdivision, which was located on the other side of the rumbling coal cars. Gillette was in Campbell County, technically out of my jurisdiction as the Absaroka County Sheriff. My daughter was having a baby in a matter of days, and I was supposed to be visiting her in Philadelphia, but instead, I was here, helping Lucian resolve his debt to a dead man. A barely audible whine keened from the back seat, and I reached around and ruffled the fur behind Dog's ears. The combination St. Bernard, German Shepherd, Dire, Wolf glanced at Lucian. The brim of my mentor's hat was pressed against the crown of his forehead, making it seem like he was galloping at a high speed like some soul-damned ghost rider in the sky. I thought about how easy it would be to just throw the big 3/4 ton into reverse and back out, turning around and take Route 1416 back up to Gillette Airport, jump on a plane. But they wouldn't allow dogs, so that was out. Wondering what I was going to do here, other than playing the role of chauffeur, I leaned back in the leather seat and felt the pressure of my Colt 1911. Maybe they'll have this talk and then we'll turn around and go home. I looked at Dog again, but he didn't look convinced. I turned back and watched the old sheriff stare at the train inside. Yeah, me neither. Pulling the collar of my sheepskin coat up a little tighter and cranking my hat down so that it didn't follow the train to Oregon, I pulled the handle on my door and slid my boots to the gravel surface, crunched around to the front of the bullet to lean on the grill guard with it. I spoke loudly in the field voice that my father had never let me use in the house, just to be heard above the endless procession of open cars and bells that hammered their warning. They still do. He studied me with a clenched eyeball and said nothing, puffing on his pipe like he was pulling a mile of coal himself. Fine bodies in the hopper cars. The accident of the train went by and another disappointment in that it was not a caboose, but rather another set of locomotives helping to push from the rear. And I got that familiar feeling I always did whenever a train passed, that I should be on it, but it was going the wrong way. Suddenly the bony arms of the crossing gates rose and the incessant clanging stopped. We listened to the wind for a while, and then the old man beat his pipe empty on the hard surface of the grill guard, unintentionally repeating the code of the klaxons. Hard times. With this singular pronouncement, he turned and climbed back in, leaving me to watch the skies peeling back in folds of gray, darker and darker to the horizon. He honked the horn behind me. That's all you get,